Hello and welcome to my Equifax breach presentation. I'd like to begin by quoting Senator Warren. "The whole thing is staggering. A company like Equifax that has sensitive personal information on most Americans should have the best data security in the industry, and instead it has the worst. And I want to understand why. Indeed, so do I, and hopefully this presentation will give us some clues." So in 2017, Equifax, one of the 3 credit bureaus in the United States, suffered what was effectively one of the worst data breaches in history, affecting over 145 million Americans. Now, it didn't help that they waited a long time, over 6 weeks, to finally disclose the breach after discovering the hackers around July 29th. To make it worse, some executives had sold their stock in early September before the public disclosure and before Equifax stock tanked. Now, instead of taking accountability for a history of poor security practices, the CEO even blamed an engineer, while many of the senior executives were given golden parachutes and were able to retire with millions. So, you are most likely affected by this because it was that wide-ranging. Some of the information stolen includes social security numbers, customer names, birth dates, email addresses, driver's license numbers, and even many credit card numbers. 76 days was the amount of time that hackers were active within Equifax's network without being discovered. But pay attention to that last statistic, 0, the number of fraud or identity theft cases that can be traced back to this incident. We'll find out why that is the case soon. So how did this happen? There was an Apache Struts vulnerability that was not properly identified, and I want you to remember that word, identified, as being present on a public website. At the same time, an expired digital certificate contributed to their attack and their ability to compromise servers and exfiltrate data without detection. Because individual databases were not segmented from each other, they were able to access additional databases. After finally gaining unencrypted credentials, they were soon given unfettered access. This is the vulnerability in question, and it was deemed critical. Yet, it was announced on March 7th that Apache software had a security patch. And yet the next day, the Department of Homeland Security notified Equifax in particular that this patch was available. And it's interesting to note that on their own website, Apache says, "It is best to think in terms of hours or a few days, not weeks or months," because we all know it's a best security practice to promptly update security patches. So this is an example, a diagram from the Government Accountability Office. Attackers would scan the web for vulnerable servers, and they found one in this dispute resolution portal that Equifax had. Now, this could have been turned on or off based on its certificates being valid, but in this case, they made a decision to prioritize usage over security, and because of that, Equifax was essentially blind to attackers exfiltrating personally identifiable information. And they were able to maintain a persistent presence all while being hidden. And these are just one of many things that could have been avoided. This is a rough timeline of the event. On March 8th is when the DHS notified Equifax, and May 13th is when hackers first began to collect personal information. July 29th is when they finally noticed attackers inside their systems and they shut down the app. September 7th was when they finally made a public announcement of the breach. September 15th, the CSO and CIO both resign, and the CEO, Smith, resigns on September 26th. Now, if we're thinking about strategic ways to prevent breaches like this, it's important to start with a framework. One of the best things about NIST is that it's very intuitive and customizable, and it's gaining traction throughout the world as being one of the best frameworks. The first function is identify, and that's what I said, remember that identify word, because you cannot protect what you can't see. If you are able to take an inventory of all your IT assets, you are in a better position to protect those. So as we look through the Equifax phase through these different functions, protect, detect, respond, and recover, we'll have a better understanding of where they came up short and how they could have had internal processes to mitigate these, and these would apply to other companies as well. Now, when it comes to different strategic goals, I think the fundamentals are what matters, and I would put building a security culture right at the top. In the Equifax case, the October Senate hearing revealed that they had already experienced 4 prior breaches and were already accused of poor cybersecurity practices. Now, this is amazing given their mandate to protect our sensitive information. But they had sufficient resources to afford the best cybersecurity, so why were they not able to respond and mitigate these attacks? According to the Government Accountability Office, this breach was completely preventable. So we have to ask ourselves, why was Equifax not showing the best cybersecurity practices? I think governance is one of the biggest issues, but if I had to sum it up in a sentence or just a slide, one answer to the conundrum might be there was a perfect storm, a culture of complacency embedded within an unaccountable bureaucracy that did not have a proactive security posture. Speaking of accountability, in the European Union there is legislation that protects consumer data, and companies must abide by this or they will suffer revenue loss. In the United States, we don't have something similar as the GDPR, and this might be an example of something that lights a fire under companies and helps them to be accountable. Now, I live in California where they have better privacy regulations, but we do not have something similar to the GDPR governing the entire United States. Now, this might act as proper shepherds of our personal data if revenue was dependent on their good custodianship. So I just raise this as a hypothesis if having policy like this might help establish a culture of accountability in the future. Again, getting back to strategy, I would put identity and access management again at the top of that list. If our goal is to have layered defenses and to strive for true defense in depth, one pillar of these would be IAM management or privileged access management, PAM management, the process by which access and privileges are granted and credentials are handled. And this would also cover best practices such as good password hygiene, multi-factor authentication. But what I want to focus on at the end there is the practice of identification, authentication, authorization, and auditing. Is it possible if they just had an internal auditing review of their security certificates that they would have found this issue and nipped it in the bud? It's just one of many speculations that we can think about the type of practices they were doing across the board. I would also tie this into secure system administration, because who has higher access and privileges than system administrators? And these are also going to be targeted by adversaries because they have the most access within an organization. But the other reason I bring this up is because of the notion of a secure development lifecycle. Why didn't they update those patches right away? Well, with Equifax, updating those patches wasn't just like we update an app on a phone where we push a button. With the Apache struts, that was something that needed to be introduced into the source code and recompiled, and so it was therefore very difficult. But within secure system administration, we would have security be a proactive thing that is baked into the coding practices and to all of the other practices that are within the security architecture. Finally, I would address offensive cybersecurity to authenticate our defensive posture, meaning if we could exercise some of what happened in the breach under controlled circumstances, they could have discovered many of these things without compromising our data. If you think about it, the 2017 breach acted like one large pen testing, but unfortunately it was done in the wild. It was not a drill. Nevertheless, Equifax would learn a very expensive lesson and have to rebuild its security posture. So we must think of offensive cybersecurity as a way that doesn't just discover vulnerabilities or find security gaps, but it authenticates our controls. It allows us to know if our security controls are doing what we intended them to do, and if they are acting as a deterrent to adversaries. Now, upon noting the widespread nature of failure, from governance down to the widespread failure to implement best security practices, I would suggest Equifax rebuild their security infrastructure from the ground up, taking into account the foundational principles I just mentioned. Interestingly enough, Equifax would indeed do just that. Now, they learned their lesson. A brand new and brilliant team was effectively given a blank check and told to make this protected and one of the best organizations, and they did just that. So borrowing from their 2020 Equifax security report, a security-first culture is the foundation of our success. Each year, 100% of our employees and leaders receive customized training, personalized scorecards, and simulations to keep their skills sharp. Now, I found this interesting that they speak in some of the same terms, that a culture is something that they deem as critical to their success, and that was obviously absent in 2017. So Equifax did turn things around, and they were humbled ultimately by their hardships and disaster, but this led them to harden their defenses and rebuild their infrastructure. Their work would bear fruit, as the company now stands as one of the most secure in the world. Here is just an example of where they are in 2020. And note that the financial services sector in general has among the best cybersecurity, just short of the military. So Equifax paid a high price, and the casualties was much of our personal data, but they have now used that as a lesson to build one of the best and most secure organizations in the world. Now back to those Chinese. You'll note I alluded to the fact that there wasn't any examples of identity theft or this information being found where you'd expect it to be, on the dark web or on the black market, but investigators kept looking for this information and could not find it. 17 months later, corroborating this info along with the TTP fingerprints that suggested the Chinese military, they put it together that this was most likely an espionage information. Now, they could have used this information for operational reasons. It could be anything from leveraging certain individuals for blackmail, or they could have flipped an election. They could basically run AI software over this data and cross-reference it with other databases. But the bottom line is that you can use it for their own operational purposes. And that's just as frightening as criminals getting access to, if not more. Now, in terms of the sources, I'm sorry this is hard to read, but I would recommend the Government Accountability Office's report in terms of detailing the litany of poor security practices they had, as well as the Equifax publications themselves from after they turned things around. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening to this presentation, and I want to give special thanks to Jason, Patrick, Heather, Emeritus, and to MIT, and all the sources who helped in guiding the creation of this presentation. Thank you very much.